Hebrews chapter 5. And we did take, it has been a couple weeks because of the doctrinal study. When we left off, we had said that basically chapters 1 through 4, we learned about the really two main things. Number one, believers are being compared to the Old Testament Israelites. Believers are being encouraged to run the race strong so that we might inherit the future kingdom. Because as Paul says here, he's warning Jewish Christians who want to turn back to Judaism to be saved. And he's urging them that though they are saved eternally, they still have a lot to lose spiritually if they abandon the faith and turn back to the works of the law to be saved. And so he has given us two really staunch warnings. One was found in Hebrews 2. Do not neglect God's salvation, the idea of shrinking back. And then in Hebrews 3 and 4, we saw the principle of a hardened heart and how that can cause people a hardened heart of disbelief in turning away from the true and living God. And he used the example of the Israelites. Now we're getting into a transitionary chapter, which will lead us into our next warning. But this transitionary chapter has been all about Jesus being our superior high priest. And then, of course, why is this significant? Because Jesus is the one mediator between man and God. Jesus, as it says in Hebrews 4:16, gives us access to the throne of grace. He gives us access to God's throne as our mediator. We don't need an earthly priest. We don't need any sort of clerical person within the church to intercede for us. Jesus is alone enough. Because of his works on the cross, Jesus is the superior high priest. And last time when we left off, we said, can you switch to the next slide? Thank you. I might need you to stay there for a minute just until we get to our next slide. Sometimes this doesn't like to work. So we'll see if we can get it going. Sorry, people online. We're working on it. But building on what we said last week, if I can retrain my thought here, what we're talking about should be up on the screen in a second. So basically, we compared the priesthood of Christ to that of the Levitical priesthood. Is it working? Is it not switching slides? We don't really need it. You can actually just... Did it work now? Okay. I was gonna say if it's not working, we don't totally need it. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So we compared the priesthood of Christ to those of the Levitical system, and we said, in fact, if you read with me in verses 5:1 through 4, which hopefully I believe that's what's up on the screen. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can have compassion on those who are ignorant and going astray, since he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. And no man takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was. And so last time, the whole principle that we talked about was the idea that the Old Testament priests were an imperfect system, because these priests had to continually offer sacrifices. Jesus' sacrifice, as we see in Hebrews 10, is a once-for-all sacrifice. Also, Jesus was tempted, but without sin. And that's why in Hebrews 4:16, he's able to aid us who are tempted, giving us access to the throne of grace, because he was tempted, yet had victory. These priests in the Old Testament, they were tempted, yet all of them sinned. It says here that they actually had to offer sacrifices for their own sins, because they're in the same boat as us. They can have compassion on us, but ultimately they can't help us like Christ can, because they themselves are sinners. And we're able to help each other and support each other, but not like Christ can, because Christ is the one mediator. He is the one who lived perfectly. He's been there, but he's been there victoriously. And that's why, as our high priest, he is the one. That's why Paul is mentioning this in Hebrews 5. Because if we want to be victorious as Christians, if we want to avoid the first two warnings that's been mentioned so far, we need to rely on Jesus as our high priest and mediator to give us access to the throne of grace and to help us in times of need. And if we do that, we can be overcoming Christians. And so let's get on to you switch slides, thank you. So if we get on to the next slide, this is going to be new information. And we're going to be here for a little bit. You can come back down now if you want, or it's up to you. We're going to be here for a little bit, and then we're going to switch. But if you'll read with me verses 5 through 6 here, it says, "So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' As he also says in another place, 'You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek.'" Okay, so I want to point out a couple things here. You notice back into verses 1 through 4, it says that the priests were called by God. That was their calling. It was the sons of Aaron, not just all the Levites, but the sons of Aaron. And it says, just as that was the case, notice verse 5, Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who said to him. So God, the Father, called Jesus to this position. And that's what it means when in John, if you write this down, John 5:24 through 27, when Jesus says, "Believe in him who sent me." That's believing in him who sent me is the idea of believing the testimony that the Father has given of the Son. This is what we talked about in our assurance study last week. If you read 1 John 5:9 through 13, this is the testimony that God has given us, eternal life. And this life is in his Son. That's 1 John 5:12. And so the Father has testified of the Son, but the Father has called the Son to become high priest. And there's actually a couple citations here that we're going to go to. But what we notice here, in fact, you have a citation in verse 5 and a citation in verse 6. And if you had a chance to read these in the last 2 weeks, you'll notice that the one in verse 5 is from Psalm chapter 2, and the one in verse 6 is from Psalm chapter 110. And so what we're going to see with these two citations as we go to them, we're going to see that there is a link between the priesthood and the kingship of Christ. There is a link between the priesthood and the kingship of Christ. And so let's go to these passages here. Let's go to Psalm chapter 2. And I get somebody to read here. When somebody gets to Psalm chapter 2, would you be able to read that? Yeah, it's 12. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, You are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter, and you will dash them to pieces like pottery. Therefore, you kings, be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you will be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him.
Okay, so what you notice here, especially in verse 8, ask of me and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. So we see here, this is a royal psalm. This is about the kingship of Christ. But this is being used in the context of chapter 5 of Hebrews. And this is being used very intentionally because the Apostle Paul is going to make a connection now between the kingship of Christ and the priesthood of Christ. And so the idea is, in Hebrews, is that Jesus is the eternal king. And in his humanity, he overcame. And we as believers, if we overcome, we will inherit with him. But the idea of how these two principles are linked is the priesthood of Christ. Christ, as our high priest, made a once-for-all atonement for our sins. and he stands daily, able to minister to us who are tempted. And he enables us to overcome in this life and to inherit with him. And so that's why the priesthood of Christ and the kingship of Christ are so closely linked, because it's the priesthood of Christ that gives us access to God and strength on a daily basis. And it's the kingship of Christ where he invites us to rule and reign with him for eternity. And so these two offices are linked. And we see that there is another person in history who has these two offices, and that is the man Melchizedek. And we're going to talk about him in a second. So in verse 6 it says, as he also says in another place, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. I actually want to look at Psalm 110, and then we're going to go back to Genesis and look at who this guy is. And again, last time I said, I won't go to war on this particular doctrine, but there are some who say that Melchizedek was a pre-incarnate Christ. I don't think that there's enough scriptural evidence within Genesis to say that. I don't think Hebrews is saying that. And I also don't think it fits with the idea of the historical narrative genre of Genesis. Okay, and that gets kind of technical. I just don't think it works. I think he was a picture of Christ. I think he's also a mysterious figure. We don't ultimately know much about him. He's not really mentioned too much in the record. In fact, there's no genealogy of Melchizedek in ancient times. So we don't know a whole lot about the guy. But I do think he was a real person. And so this is a very short psalm as well. I'll read this. So your title might say Announcement of the Messiah's Reign. It says, a psalm of David. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of your strength out of Zion. Roll in the midst of your enemies. So you're already seeing the messianic aspect here. Your people shall be volunteers in the day of your power and the beauties of holiness. From the womb of the morning you have the dew of your youth. The Lord has sworn and will not relent. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He shall execute kings in the days of his wrath. He shall judge among the nations. He shall fill the places with dead bodies. He shall execute the heads of many countries. He shall drink of the brook of the wayside. Therefore he shall lift up the head. And so you can't really get much more messianic predictions than you get in Psalm 110 and Psalm 2. Jesus is the fulfillment of these predictions. Now, the first time Jesus came, he came to offer his body. These are referring to the second coming of Christ, when he will assume the throne of David. Now, you'll notice a lot of these psalms that are messianic are in fact written by David, because in fact, they're actually double fulfillment prophecies, meaning in one sense, they're fulfilled by David. He's writing as himself. When David writes, my God, why have you forsaken me? That had an immediate interpretation. But we see later on that Christ was actually the ultimate fulfillment of that, saying those same words on the cross. And so we see that, yes, these are Psalms of David, and there is some immediate interpretation, but ultimately, David, and I think he even understood the significance of his words, that this is referring to a future king that would descend from David. This is referring to the Lord's chosen one, the God's Christ, the one he would send to rule over the nations. And so one thing about verse 4, though, that I want to point out, I think it's interesting that in the middle, like smack dab in the middle of a royal psalm, he goes off into this discourse about you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And so what this does, this directly ties the kingship of Christ and the priesthood of Christ together. We see that these two offices are distinct, they're unique, but they are closely linked. Christ is both a king and he's a priest. He is a king, he is sovereign, he is the one who rules the nations, he is the one who has invited us all to participate in his future role. He is the one who has invited us to live the life victoriously for him. He has prepared, Ephesians 2:10, works beforehand that we should walk in them. And that the hope would be that we rule and reign with him for eternity. But he is our priest in that he has offered his body once for all to bring us into his family and to make it possible to be in heaven to begin with. to make it possible to have access to God. And in that way, he is the perfect high priest because, as it says, if you go to actually Hebrews 10, now this is definitely reading ahead a little bit, but in Hebrews 10, verse 10, I would actually encourage you to read ahead and read this chapter because it really ties in with how Christ is a perfect high priest. But so there's really two functions as high priest. He offers his body, and he stands continually to be our intercessor. He stands continually to be our mediator. As you're going there, remember the words of Job. Job said, "Who could stand in between me and God?" Now, that's a big-time paraphrase. But basically, Job questioned in himself, who could argue with God? Who could stand as a mediator between me and God? Who could possibly do that? Well, Job knew that there was something missing. Now, obviously, he didn't know, fully about Christ, but he knew that there was something missing. Notice what Hebrews 10:10 says. By that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest stands ministering daily and offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. From that time, waiting until his enemies be made his footstool. So notice the comparison again, the priesthood and the kingship. He completed his works on the cross as the priest. Now he waits as the coming king at the right hand of God. For by one offering he has perfected forever those who are being sanctified. Now notice verse 14. It's got some interesting key things there. By his offering he has perfected us forever. But notice the last part of verse 14. Those who are being sanctified. So his offering has perfected us in a positional sense, but there are after effects of his offering. And that is that we are continually being sanctified and brought into holiness and right living and in closer relationship with God. And so as a priest, he set us apart forever. But he stands continually so that we might continue to be set apart and sanctified on a daily basis. And with the end goal of ruling and reigning with him. In fact, if you go to Revelation, now this was not on my agenda, but I do want to read something for you here. If you go to Revelation 20, verse 4, this is just one example of ruling and reigning with Christ. Now, what we see, the ruling and reigning with Christ aspect in his eternal kingdom, the first part of the kingdom is going to last 1,000 years. And then the second part of his kingdom is going to be eternal in the new creation. So this is like the opening segment of his rule. It says, "And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them. Then I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their witness to Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years, but the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but," now notice this, "they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years." And so the idea is that those who overcome, this is a principle all throughout Revelation. Peter even calls us a holy priesthood. And the reason it calls us that is because of what Paul says in Romans 12, 1 and 2. We offer up our bodies as living sacrifices. We offer up the sacrifice of praise. That's our worship as priests of God, as a holy priesthood, as that terminology is used. And so I like the connection here because it says they will rule and reign. They shall be priests of God and of Christ and shall reign with him 1,000 years. So again, there is this connection between the priesthood and the kingship. And so that's our final goal as believers, is to be able to rule and reign with Christ as priests and kings, obviously under his rulership. And so if you go back to Genesis, though, I want to give you the historical context for this. Genesis 14. 18. And so, in fact, we're not going to read all of the all of the context, but basically there is a huge war. If you remember, Lot had lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and there was a war between the kings of Sodom, the king of Sodom, Gomorrah, and a bunch of other cities we're not going to say because I don't want to hack the pronunciations. There's even a guy named Shador Lamor, which is a cool name. We're gonna skip through that segment though. But basically, after this huge battle, Abraham is victorious. He essentially helps the king of Sodom, and so there's this big victory. And so, in fact, in verse 17, if you start with me in verse 17, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sheba, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Shador Lamor and the kings who were with him. So this huge victory. Now notice in verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem. Salem is Jerusalem, by the way. That's what it's referring to. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand, and he gave him a tithe of all. There's a couple really significant things here. If you'll remember, we said that Jesus as priest is superior to the sons of Aaron. One really important thing here. Within the Levitical system, only the sons of Aaron were permitted to be priests. Only the sons of Aaron, no one else. If they tried to minister, bad things happen. If you read the Old Testament, if someone else tried to do the function of a priest or go into the Holy of Holies when they were not supposed to, bad things would happen, to say the least. So the question is, how is Jesus a priest if he is not one of the sons of Aaron? Because Jesus, this is not necessarily according to the Levitical system. This is according to a higher priesthood. If you notice the last part of verse 20, it says, and he gave him a tithe of all. Abraham tithed, we assume would be a tenth or maybe more of what his possessions were to Melchizedek. This is an assertion by Abraham that Melchizedek is greater than he is at this time period. And so that means it follows logically that the priesthood that follows from Abraham is not as great as the priesthood which descends from Melchizedek, since Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. And so it's kind of like a little logical thing kind of looking at this, but the priesthood of Melchizedek is greater than that of Aaron, because Aaron is from Abraham, and Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. And so this is to show, and that's why he keeps saying, that's why he says in Psalm 110, that's why he says in Hebrews 5, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. He is saying that you are a priest according to a higher priesthood than these priests that are offering sacrifices, which can never take away sins. This sacrifice is a once-for-all sacrifice. And so it's interesting, if we go too much further on some of this Old Testament stuff, it could lead us onto a little bit of a rabbit trail. We're still, I don't think, oh, now it's working. That's really odd, but we'll take it. All right, so I have some reflection questions here. I kind of want us to think about, I wouldn't necessarily say we want to discuss all of these. I would say, I would say questions 3 and 4 definitely kind of use those as just like a self-reflection thing to kind of think about maybe in the upcoming week. But I want to ask you guys the first question, just kind of open the floor here. Kind of reflecting on what we've seen so far as Jesus as our high priest. What are some ways, and it's okay, we'll see what we got here as far as ideas, but what are some ways that we can apply the teaching of Jesus being our high priest and king to our daily life? So this is like a complex doctrinal thing we've seen. What are some ways that we can simplify this now and actually use this in our daily life? Can anybody think of any ways in which this gives you hope in your daily life? Some kind of way that you can apply these spiritual truths and or live this out. The idea that Christ is both your priest and your king. Just asking as a thought. If there's no thoughts on this one, it might be a good reflection question for the week possibly to think about. Think about how this, and I could even list a few to break the ice. So mull that over, think about that thought. I would say for me, sometimes I get anxious, and so it's like, it's good for me to know that Christ has made every way possible to God, and I have confidence that God hears me.
I was just gonna say, you know, he is our intercessor, so being the high priest, you're just praying to him every day, you know, relating our thoughts to God.
Right. And you think about other world religions. I mean, whether it be Islam or some of these other religions, God is basically unknowable in those religions. And I'm not saying that as a ad hominem or to kind of like offend people, but really that's true. According to their religious systems, their God is basically unknowable and unapproachable. And our God's not like that. Our God obviously sent his own son. He stands daily as our intercessor. And so we have direct access. And so that's something I think oftentimes I don't reflect on enough, probably. What about our prayer life? How would this teaching affect our prayer life, you think? Just kind of thinking about it. Obviously in a positive way, right? So if you're thinking about, and I think I've admitted this before, I think prayer life is something that I for one, I've always said I need to like work on, be more consistent. You know, 'cause sometimes I'll go through streaks where I'm praying a lot, other times it's like you get into the day. But if you really actually take this authoritatively and really think about Christ being our high priest, you know, the idea that he is interceding directly, God directly hears our prayers, that we are the temple of God, we have the Holy Spirit living within us. This will revolutionize our idea of prayer and really, really give us a lot of confidence. As it says in Hebrews 4:16, that we should confidently go to the throne of grace. And so these questions, I mean, really, I'd like to actually think about, verse, or question number 4 I have up here. And maybe actually in the coming week, we'll actually start with these questions. So maybe this week leading into next, maybe try to jot down a few ideas for these. Just think about how you can apply these to your life. But especially question 4. It says, how often do we take advantage of the fact that we have full access to the throne of grace? You know, this is not necessarily something that they had in the Old Testament. But how often do we take advantage of this huge opportunity that we have in the New Testament time period? And so really think about those questions. And I actually want to read a few more verses here and move forward. Now, this is going to be on your new sheet here. Looking at Hebrews, there it is, okay. Hebrews 5:9 through 11. Okay, so this is building on what we've just seen in verses 1 through 8. It says, and having been perfected, talking about Christ, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, called by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. Okay, so I want to ask question A here. I just want to see about do a little interpretive analysis of verse 9. So the conclusion is this, and I'm just curious to see how we get to this conclusion. Verse 9, that type of salvation, that is not talking about salvation from hell. How do we know this? There is a clue in the text that tells us. Because remember, in Hebrews 1:14, it talks about salvation. But we've already said there's 3 different kinds of salvation in the New Testament. Salvation doesn't always refer to salvation from hell. There can be different kinds of salvation or deliverance. It means to be delivered from something. What is it in verse 9 that tells us that this cannot be talking about salvation from hell? As a hint, it's in the second part of verse 9. Yes?
Where it says, having been perfected, so that already happened before.
Ooh,
So
that's good. I wasn't even actually considering that part of it. But that's perfect. No, no pun intended there. That is good. that is good, actually, because I was actually looking towards the end of verse 9. But yeah, that's actually yet another clue there that I skipped over because I was so busy looking at the second part of verse 9. Yeah, we've already been perfected. So that's one part of it. Obviously, Hebrews 10, as we read, we believe we're sanctified already in the past. But notice the second part.
Eternal.
Yeah. To all who obey him is the other part. Okay, so if this is talking about salvation from hell, since when is salvation from hell based on whether we obey Christ or not? That would be works salvation. So that's a very easy way to tell. If you see something about works within the clues of the text, we know that this can't be talking about, as we said, now other classes might not be familiar with these terms, but phase one salvation. And by the way, I would like to eventually make this available in online format somehow, like on Google Drive or something like that, as far as, so you can have access to all these files. We've been printing from the beginning, but if you're missing some stuff, we can get like one big file for you. But yeah, so it says, having been perfected, we've already talked about what that means in terms of Christ. Christ's work on earth was perfected. Not that he himself wasn't perfect. Perfection means brought to completion. Okay, brought to full maturity or brought to full completion. And so Jesus at the cross, his works were made perfect. It was verified that he lived the perfect life, he completed the work that the Father had given him, and that's verified by his resurrection from the dead. And he has become the author of eternal salvation to those who obey him. This eternal salvation is talking about the kind of future deliverance that we have mentioned throughout this entire book so far. The idea of being delivered into the future kingdom of God victoriously and having and sharing future glory with Christ in his kingdom. That's what this is talking about. It's talking about if we obey Christ, we fall into this category. And so, but notice what it says in verse 11. It says, of whom we have much to say and hard to explain. Why is it hard to explain to his audience? Since you have become dull of hearing. The word dull is the idea of like of becoming lackadaisical or lazy, the idea of letting things slip. And so we see today, and in fact, we're not going to be able to go too much farther because we're just about at the end here, but I'd like you to really consider this slide and the next slide here. It says, how do we avoid this same pitfall as believers today that we hear in verse 11? The idea of becoming dull of hearing. They weren't even able to understand the doctrinal teaching of Paul here in Hebrews 5 because their hearing had become dull. We see, if you want to reread Hebrews 2:4 and Hebrews 3:12 through 14, that gives us a clue as to some things that happened to this group of believers. But also, if you want to go on to the next set of questions, verses 12 through 14, that's what we're going to kind of, so for next week, just to give you some idea of what we've said, these reflection questions, I'm going to ask you a few of these again, see if we get some more thoughts this week. And then we'll pick up with the sheet that I gave you today. We'll talk about how and why the audience became dull of hearing, how we can avoid that pitfall as believers today. And then in verses 12 through 14, we'll get through the rest of the chapter in chapter 5. We'll finish chapter 5 next week. And we'll see about the idea of solid food versus the milk of the word, the real difference between the two and the difference it makes in our lives. And so, all right, I'll close this in prayer. Guys, thank you for the discussion, for the study in God's word. And thanks to everybody, by the way, who joined us online. I didn't greet you at the beginning, but thank you. It's good to have you guys here too.